Now, my great pleasure to introduce Bank of America's Chief Strategist, Joe Quinlan, who's joining us via phone from New York. With nearly 20 years of financial services experience, Joe is a leading expert on the transatlantic economy. He lectures on finance and global economics at New York University and is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins Center for Transatlantic Relations. Joe co-authors the annual Transatlantic Economy Report together with his colleague, Dan Hamilton, and is with us today to talk about the key findings from their 2020 report. And just a quick note, if you have any questions during Joe's presentation, please submit them in the chat field. So with that, Joe, thank you so much for joining us and taking time with us to be here, and the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm just, for kind of a compliance outlier, my presentation is based on the study that Dan and I did from Johns Hopkins. So it reflects our inputs related to the study. So I just want to make that clear. Nothing to do with my day job. And this year, as you know, very challenging. I've been a global economist for 30 years plus, and I'm dating myself. And as we work through the numbers with COVID-19, the global shutdown, lockdown, the supply-demand shock rippling across the world, we have to create whole new models, have to recreate how we think about trade, globalization, and supply chains and down the line. So I don't want to be over dramatic and I don't want to be too pessimistic, but we're clearly in uncharted waters. And I'll just give you a little perspective. When we had the great financial crisis of 08 and 09, many economists and strategists like myself, we could pinpoint where the problem was. And you could kind of figure out, relatively speaking, how we work out of the problem. With this problem, pandemic, much difference. It's science, it's Mother Nature, it's the globalization, it's the populism, it's a U.S. presidential election. So there's a lot to consider and a lot to talk about. And my last slide, I will kind of summarize kind of where we're at, because I do think we're in this very steep cyclical downturn in global growth. No one will be spared. It's unprecedented. It's Great Depression-like numbers. But then there's also the structural long-term themes, dynamics playing out as well that I think is going to affect the relationship between the United States and Europe and the United States and Denmark. So, but I'll start out by saying also that Steve is dead right, that when you look at the globe, the most important relationship in the world still remains the United States and Europe. That hasn't changed. It's not going to change. In fact, with the United States and China basically in a Cold War that's not going to end anytime soon, whether we get a new administration or not, that is a key issue for the United States and the transatlantic partnership to grapple with. How do we deal with China? How does China deal with us? How does China deal individually with Denmark and other parts of the European Union? So if you just go to the first slide, or the second slide actually, slide 2, the COVID-19 induced transatlantic recession, these are unprecedented in terms of what's happening. So we're looking, obviously everyone on the phone knows this is old news. What I'm really kind of concerned about is 21, right? We do have penciled in a snapback or a rebound in 2021, but that's hardly a given. Here in the United States, there is questions about reopening, and it's one thing to reopen the economy. It's another to go into a restaurant, get on a plane, and to get back to normal. I think normalization is a ways out beyond 21, 22. We don't get normalization in terms of consumer behavior until we get a vaccination, and that's still out there, as everyone knows. So we're looking at unprecedented numbers, downturn, transatlantic economy. No doubt about it. Trade is falling. Foreign direct investment has come down. There's more of a sense of isolation, protectionism, populism on both sides of the Atlantic that we're going to have to work through. And I think we will work through it, but there'll be some changes as well. If you go to slide 3, this talks directly what Steve talked about at the beginning, the cumulative U.S. foreign direct outflows, clearly still. And when you take out some of the financial engineering that companies do in and around the smaller parts of Europe, at the end of the day, the United States counts on Europe as kind of a second market, big wealthy market to drive growth, drive earnings, drive employment, and drive just prosperity and development. This relationship has been hugely successful for decades, and I think that's going to be the same for 2020, albeit we've got some bumps in the road here you have to play out. The next slide, transatlantic trade ties, just gives you kind of an idea, total trade EU 28 or EU x the UK. You can see trade is very important. We're overlaying, it complements the investment I just talked about. But look at the EU 28 relative to Mexico, China, Japan. So there's still a lot of trade out there, albeit we've seen a cyclical downturn beginning in March, and for basically for the balance of this year. Slide 5, I believe, foreign affiliate sales, U.S. trade deficit. You know, this is very important in the sense that here in the United States, we're focused on our trade deficit. That's in goods. We don't recognize that we have a trade surplus in services. And services, digital, I'm going to talk about digitalization. That's the kind of the new buzzword here, as everyone's working remotely, traveling less, telecommuting, telemedicine, hugely important. So service activity between the United States and Denmark is going to be hugely important as we go deeper into this decade. And the slide to the right just shows how important, how embedded U.S. firms are in Denmark, Denmark firms are in the United States, and how we do business. We do business on the ground in each other's communities and states. And you can see that clearly in terms of how much money we derive from foreign affiliate sales versus trade and exports and our imports. The next slide, page, slide 6, this shows you what's been going on with the tax reform coming out of late 2018, or 2017, I should say, 18, what happened. We did bring a lot of that money home. You can see clearly kind of the huge surge in money coming back to the United States. It created a net outflow. If you go to slide 7, you can see U.S. outflows also weaker to Europe. Not unexpected. We expected this, no doubt. But some of this is kind of like financial accounting. I'm gonna call it engineering. That doesn't sound right, but it doesn't take away from the fact that when companies here in the United States are looking for overseas resources, markets, wealthy consumers, highly skilled labor, technology skills, they're looking to Europe. That hasn't changed. I mean, Latin America is still just kind of a commodity-driven, commodity-dependent part of the world. China has some huge issues to deal with internally and externally. You know, the Middle East still commodity-dependent. Really, Africa coming on. There's no other place outside the United States and North America, so to speak, like Europe in terms of its cohesion, its wealth, its ability to help drive U.S. earnings. And that's not going to change anytime soon. If you go to slide 8, this gives you a snapshot. U.S.-Denmark foreign investment ties remain very strong. What I particularly like about this slide is that, you know, we've seen a cyclical downturn here at U.S. investment in Denmark, but notice that on a historic cost basis, that's what these numbers are, there's more investment, Denmark investment in the U.S. than the U.S. in Denmark. So, I mean, that's very beneficial for a lot of U.S. states, towns, municipalities. That kind of gets forgotten when we talk about trade and the deficits and unlevel playing fields and on down the line. So really, you know, the United States enjoys a very robust presence and partnership with Denmark, and actually benefits when you kind of aggregate the numbers out in terms of who invests more. But it's a healthy relationship. You can see the big upturn. The Denmark position in the United States was led by transportation, food and beverage companies, technology. It's a very healthy, robust relationship that's going to, I think, continue and be beneficial to both parties. The next slide, slide 9. Just a couple of slides here. You know, why Denmark? And this is very important. You know, why do, and this is something Dan and I have been harping on for literally decades. U.S. multinationals, or even Danish multinationals, European multinationals, they go overseas where the wealth is, where the money is, where the consumers are, where the human capital, right? We're not chasing cheap labor anymore because that's all over the world and you can automate. So the ease of doing business, look where Denmark ranks relative to the world. It's very well up there. And that just speaks volumes about your policymakers, how they have the eye on the ball when it comes to creating the right environment for investing and creating that right backdrop for firms, whether they're from U.S., Europe, all over the world. You know, how you treat capital, how you welcome multinationals, how you set up your infrastructure matters. And you can see clearly how much Denmark ranks, very high up on the scale. I see Georgia there at number 7. I'm not quite sure how that popped into the top 10, but be that as it may. But, you know, Denmark is among the winners when it comes to being open, being competitive, being focused, being really laser-like honed in on what multinationals need to do to succeed. And you can see New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, some of the most competitive, open, dynamic economies in the world. And I'd overlay South Korea, US in there as well. So that's one reason why US companies are in Denmark. If you go to the next slide, slide 10, excuse me, slide 10, this is the global competitiveness rankings that we watch every year. They're not perfect. They're not perfect. But they're directional. And they give you an idea, they give you a narrative about, comparatively speaking, what countries get it when it comes to being competitive on a global basis and what countries don't. And Denmark ranks very nicely up there, with also some other countries across the European Union, UK included. But look at Sweden, Germany, Switzerland. Here again, Singapore, Hong Kong. These are governments, these are policymakers, these are business environments that multinationals look for and can thrive in, can make money, can take their money out, can sleep at night when it comes to a rule of law, transparency, intellectual property rights. These are hugely important variables, and Denmark ranks very well, and hence why there's a premium on U.S. multinationals being in Denmark, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Slide 11, very important, kind of reverses it a little bit. European companies are highly exposed and leveraged to the United States. You can see Denmark here. We look to the Denmark MSCI very much when it comes to earnings or revenues, bottom line, so to speak. 28% derived out of the United States, the bigger market. Look at China relative to the U.S. when it comes to Danish revenue exposure. Much deeper ties, much deeper exposure to the U.S. than China. And China, let's be fair, is important. There's no doubt about that in terms of technology sense, automobile, you name it, life sciences. But when it comes to, at the end of the day, as Steve talked about at the outset, the deepest roots, the largest relationship, the most integrated partnership is still between the United States and Europe, including Denmark. So a very, very interesting chart there, or table, I should say, when it comes to where the exposure lies amongst corporate Denmark for here in the United States. The next slide, slide 12, profits, at risk from coronavirus, no doubt, right? We're going to see a downturn in everything, right? 2020 is just going to be one of those asterisks. It'll be one of those years when we say, like, wow, do you remember what happened in 2020? And as I said at the outset, I just hope it doesn't spill over or bleed over into 2021. We should be more in recovery phase by then. And yes, there'll be a second wave. And yes, we're going to have to kind of work carefully state by state, European country by European country. But it's going to be choppy. And so hence, if there is a profits downturn or profits recession transatlantically, I think that's already baked into the cake. That doesn't surprise anyone on this conference as we speak. Slide 13, very interesting, U.S.-Denmark trade, just by sector, kind of gives you an idea. It's really kind of pretty well diverse, relatively speaking. Our U.S. exports to Denmark, our imports from Denmark, ours meaning the United States. But here's what's very interesting. U.S., you see down below, services trade. U.S. exports of services to Denmark, 5.8 billion versus 3.2 billion in goods. And this is, I think, kind of the next phase of U.S.-Danish relationship. It's going to be digital. It's going to be more in services. It's going to be high-end tech, software, intellectual property rights, content, e-learning, e-health. This is where we're going, and I do think this is a dynamic new phase of the relationship, and the one I think we've got a good category head start on. Other business services, that's that catch-all in terms of a lot of data processing, data storage. You could throw renewable energy in there as well. So I'm very excited, and when I look bilaterally, the relationship between the United States and Denmark, because I see a lot of upside in terms of where the world is headed, particularly when it comes to the digitalization of the global economy, which we really are in the early innings. Slide 14, second to the last slide. I'm not going to, you can read this. We just kind of summarized everything, but everything just summarized what we just went over. this is a very healthy relationship, right? We're going to come out of the pandemic, I think, stronger, healthier between the United States and Denmark because there's very strong roots. You know, we'll bend and not break. Think of it that way. But really, the last slide is what I want to talk about, and that's the post-COVID-19 world. And this is something we've spent a lot of time thinking about here in New York, about how does the post-COVID world look in 22, 23, 24. And there's some good news and there's some bad news. And that's something, you know, we just got to work through, or some challenges. Call them challenges versus opportunities. Deglobalization, no doubt about it. A force that's gaining tide, it's gaining momentum. If you see what, you know, Prime Minister Modi said in India the other day, you know, everything local, we're going to become self-sufficient. Obviously, when it comes to the pharmaceutical firms, there's going to be a lot of repositioning, reshoring of medical global supply chains out of India, out of China. Could be mandated here in the United States, or giving strong incentives from the public sector to do that. So deglobalization is gaining traction. Is globalization? No. No, it's not over, but it's going to be rethought, reconfigured, and it's going to be a driving force that we have to look at very carefully. And by the way, you can have deglobalization at the same time having continued strong, deeper relationship between the United States and Denmark, right? It doesn't mean the whole world pulls up the drawbridge and doesn't do business. That's not going to happen. And I do think the United States multinationals are going to be much more selective about where they put that next plant, data storage unit, where they invest that money in IT. And I think Denmark comes out ahead. It's going to be a winner because for all those attributes I talked about earlier in terms of the human capital, the competitiveness, the ease of doing business. The second box, everything. And this means electronic. We are going virtual, right? Not that we're going to leave the physical world. No, we're not going to do that. But we are going to be doing a lot more things remotely, over the internet, digitally, and that's not going to change. It's been accelerated. And there's a great quote from the CEO of Microsoft basically saying that, you know, all of the technological advances that they saw in front of them in the next 2 years were pulled forward by in the last 2 months, which is a remarkable statement, right? We're pulling forward all the kind of electric, you know, when it comes to e-commerce, the capabilities. And when I mean everything, electronically, I mean retail, finance, health, you know, games, sports, travel, I mean, you name it. And I do think there's a lot of synergies there, a lot of opportunities for Danish companies, U.S. companies that kind of work together, merge, or have collaborative experiences that help drive this process. The next one, next gen tech infrastructure. The United States is behind when it comes to 5G, quantum computing, fiber optics, but we're going to see a big focus on bringing our internet, our broadband, everything related to kind of the new 21st century tech infrastructure. That's going to be much more an emphasis here in the United States. And that helps drive that digital trade and services between the United States and Denmark. We have a lot to learn from Denmark in terms of having a world-class 21st century infrastructure that's driven more by 5G, fiber optics instead of cable, and what comes with that. Whole new industries are going to pop up in and around the new infrastructure of this decade. The next one, big government, no doubt about it. Governments are getting bigger. Companies are going to get bigger as well on the other side of this. And what I mean by big government is that, you know, seriously, here in the United States, there's talk of industrial policy. Some people argue, you know, we're going to become more of a mixed economy. We're going to become a state economy. We're going to go the socialist route. I don't believe any of that. But there's no doubt, because of the public sector focus on healthcare, that the government has to be involved, that's not going to change anytime soon. You overlay that with the protectionism, the reshoring, and yes, big government is here. Doesn't crush the free market. It's not going to kill off the private sector, but this is a big issue for a lot of U.S. companies to deal with in that sense. So we got to watch the regulatory backdrop, not only in the United States, but also Europe as well. The next check mark, healthcare infrastructure, innovation, no doubt about it. You're going to see a lot more spending on global healthcare. We weren't ready for the pandemic. We were overwhelmed, our healthcare system, and that's going to change. If you look at global healthcare spending as a percent of GDP, It's been stuck at 10% for the last decade. Meanwhile, we've had more people on planet Earth, more non-communicable diseases spreading around the world, more obesity, and now a pandemic. And so the global healthcare infrastructure was caught on the hop here, was not ready for this pandemic. But we see a lot more spending in this space, private sector and public sector. And this is one area I think there could be some opportunities for the United States and Danish and from companies from Denmark to kind of work together collaboratively as we speak when it comes to vaccination, treatments, new equipment, diagnostic equipment, using technology, and so forth. So another checkbox, biosecurity, hugely important. This is being very important when it comes to travel, taking your temperature, getting your mask. That's not changing anytime soon. There's some privacy issues in and around here, how we use data, how we track and trace people, huge new world that we're in. Cybersecurity, another one, not going away. Obviously, you know, where you folks are sitting in Denmark right now, big issue related to Russia, big issue related to China, Iran, North Korea, not going away. And there, I think here again leads itself a lot of collaboration opportunities between the United States and Denmark. And then last but not least, artificial intelligence. We're bringing it forward, right? We're going to use AI to do a lot of things when it comes to healthcare, finance, remote computing, electrical vehicles, driverless vehicles. Yeah, I'm very encouraged and optimistic about the future of the global economy and the wherewithal for everyone on the phone, the great companies on the phone, to drive innovation, drive growth once we get through the pandemic. And I think we're going to learn a lot about the pandemic in terms of responsiveness, how we use healthcare, merge it with technology, how we do tracing, tracking in the right way. I mean that, and that's, I want to caveat that we're going to, I do think in the post-COVID-19 world, you know, I think we're healthier, we're stronger, we're ready for the next problem, and there'll always be an issue. But I do think here and now, 2020, it's just a lost year. I don't think it's a lost decade. There's too much pessimism out there, and there's too much gloom and doom in and around, you know, the numbers, the unemployment rate, you know, comparisons to the Great Depression. We'll work through this. There's no doubt about this. I mean, science and technology wins. Science and technology will win in the end and beat back the virus. We'll learn from it. We'll be stronger. And so the United States and Denmark, the key, my message is keep doing what you're doing, build the bridges, deepen the roots, and become more embedded in each other markets, ignore the noise, you know, let's work more bilaterally. I mean, there's a lot of tension points between the United States and Brussels, but from my point of view, you know, it's kind of like set that aside. Let's just dig in deeper and make this relationship stronger. So, Steve, with that, I'll just take any questions. I know I ran a little long, but we'll take a couple.
Thank you, Joe. That certainly wasn't the conversation we talked about 3 months ago, was it?
No, not at all. You're absolutely right.
So, and you know, I mean, I appreciate your frankness and openness, but also that it's not all bad. There's opportunities coming our way. I think it was highly interesting where you put Denmark and their positioning, and that they necessarily won't be impacted by the deglobalization. But what would you advise a country like Denmark to do, and the Danish companies? But also bilaterally, you know, what's Denmark need to do to keep the U.S. companies investing here, and how can they, you know, what can they do to get their fair piece of the cake as we emerge out of this crisis?
Yeah, but Steve, I'm glad you posed that question, because there I would say, because I missed it or I didn't bring it up, but you know, environment, social, and governance, ESG. Everyone's heard this term, and I do think, you know, we're moving closer to shareholder capitalism, you know, whereby it's all about the profit, and we're moving closer to stakeholder capitalism, where it's about the environment. It's about, you know, how you treat women in the workforce, how you have family leave, your way of life, how you treat the climate, renewables. And there's a lot Denmark can teach the United States. There's a lot you can teach us. So I'd like to see Denmark, or your companies in Denmark, really be the champion of ESG, be the leaders, pull us forward, show us how it works, because I do think that, you know, you're the giant, we're the minnow, we have a lot to learn, and collaboratively we can push forward, because that's a huge new dynamic about there. It's like how companies treat the environment, the workers, how they, everything related to that. That's hugely important. So I would propose to Denmark, the Danish companies, your organization, be the leader, we'll be the follower. And, and I think that's a great way to kind of take that relationship to the next level.
Fantastic advice. In fact, one of our participants had a question around, using the COVID-19, as an accelerator on the zero carbon policies and activities. So I think that ties in very well. I think you more or less answered that question. Anything more on environment and that, moving towards, do you see this crisis as an opportunity to help reach our climate goals?
I mean, it's remarkable. The only thing that could stop global climate change, the carbon emissions going up, was the COVID-19. It's like a clash of the titans. When climate change meant COVID-19, like wow, it was overwhelmed. But can we learn from this, Steve? I mean, carbon emissions could go down by 8% this year because of the lockdown, but I'm afraid we just kind of re-accelerate into 21, 22. And there's a lot of, we're still focused on renewable energies, but when you have oil prices there negative at one point, which is crazy, fossil fuels, I think there's a lot. I think we got a snapshot of what the world can look like when we do stop treating the earth the way we treat it day in and day out, with the travel, with the fossil fuels, burning cars. And I'm not proposing that we stop everything. We just got to keep that snapshot in mind in terms of the emissions coming down. How do we further that? And obviously the answer isn't to lock down the global economy, of course. It's going to be through science, it's going to be through technology. So, we have a chance here to kind of I think it's a wake-up call that, the wake-up call was like how much we do pollute the earth. And when we stop doing that, how much it cleans itself up, and it's a better world. But how do we mesh that with overall growth? We need to drive. We need to get to work. We're going to have to get back on airplanes at some point. But how do we do that in more carbon friendly? That's going to be hugely important. And I would say, related to that, Steve, I'm worried. I'll be dead honest with you. I'm worried about the debt that comes out of fighting this virus, right? In Europe, in the United States, we're going to be deeper in a hole when it comes to debt. So then that means the spending gets harder, or we got to prioritize our spending, because there's a huge cost coming out. The bill for this pandemic is massive. We can work our way through it, but I hope we don't skimp on climate change spending as a result. Yeah,
no, that's a very good point, and I think also it's really food for thought when you really look at the big picture and look about, I think we've talked about this before also, Joe. Maybe you could comment very briefly about Europe's position versus the U.S. position. You look how quickly the U.S. has shed jobs during this crisis, where Europe, because of our laws and employment laws, it takes time and it goes slower. But on the other hand, the U.S. tends to accelerate quicker. So in this, where are we going to be positioned, Europe versus U.S., as far as coming out of this crisis?
Well, good question. I'm encouraged, very encouraged, that in Denmark, you're reopening the economy. So is Germany, other parts of Europe. We're doing it in the typical ad hoc, fragmented, hyperbolic, screaming way that we're doing it. So you could argue against that. But the good news is, believe it or not, the United States did learn a lesson, not the full lesson, from Europe, from the Great Financial Crisis. The Great Financial Crisis comes in 2008 and 2009. And U.S. companies just slash and burn their employment levels, right? We hack out everything. This time around, we learned from Europe, like, okay, if you fire workers, it's hard to bring them back. Keep them on the payrolls, furlough them instead of laying them off. So really, the numbers, the unemployment numbers in the United States, they're pretty horrific. But around 80% of the unemployed workers in the United States are temporary. So it means they're not off the payroll, so to speak, completely like we had in the last crisis. So we learned a little bit, but we have here in the United States, it's going to be hard to bring that labor back, because I do think, particularly in small businesses, they're going bust. They're not going to bring back, if they have 10 workers, and maybe they bring back 5. So it's we went from a fully employed labor market to one now where, 1 in 5 people are unemployed. The good news is their benefits are there. They've got a little extra money from the government. I will give high marks, relatively speaking, to Congress and the Federal Reserve for acting swiftly, getting the monies in the credit market, getting the money out to households. It's still painful, but your model is better than ours when it comes to keeping people employed and active. But I think we learned a few lessons from the financial crisis. Not perfect, but we'll see what I'm confident that we'll see growth return in 21, but it's on a sector by sector. It won't be evenly dispersed.
Got it. We had a question coming in from our friends at Novo Nordisk, and he's certainly happy you included obesity as a health driver. But Novo Nordisk can help with this, but there's a very significant access barrier to the U.S. Most of the top commercial health plans cover FDA-approved medications for obesity, and nearly 65 million commercially insured patients currently have access to these treatments. However, Medicare still doesn't provide the same type of access for seniors. So we'd be interested to work with anyone on this, and any thoughts on that? Any experience?
No, Steve. I can't. We're all healthcare specialists now on Wall Street because of the pandemic, and I say that kiddingly, but also we've been just studying this relationship. Healthcare is just the holy grail here. Going into the pandemic, we had 27 million U.S. citizens with no health care. And that's an issue that's got to be talked about and have an honest debate later. But I can't get into the specifics, but as everyone knows, obesity creates its own problems, its own costs later in the patients. That it adds to the problem. So. But I do think, when it comes to family leave, our breadth of the healthcare system, how we're going to totally rethink our healthcare system here in the United States, and the rethink's probably going to take a decade, but you know how it works here. But so I can't be any more specific than that. Sorry.
Fair enough. I get it. Maybe just as we round out here, just a couple of very concrete, big picture questions. Do you think this economic crisis? Do you see it as a possible turning point for the good, or the opposite of that as far as transatlantic relations go? And again, with countries looking more inward, and so how do you see the transatlantic relationship faring as we come out of COVID?
Well, that's a great question. From the European point of view, I want to see Brussels and U.S. technology companies work better together, have an honest conversation, pull back the covers on when it comes to privacy, data storage, internet, and so forth. We're seeing, we're seeing acceleration of everything remote, digital. But will the European Union keep up with us? With the transatlantic economy? I'd like to see one digital transatlantic economy. That would be very powerful, but that there's sector-specific relations in and around that. Because I said digitalization is going to be huge, tackling a lot of these issues, whether it's biosecurity, cybersecurity, public health care. So I think I just hope it's less bad. Let me put it this way. I think, and I'm going to be honest with you, it's going to depend on who's going to occupy the White House, come next January. We'll see how that plays out. It's going to be very interesting. But either or, Democrat or Republican, there's no doubt in this country, here in the United States, that there is a populist anti-globalization, foreign phobia out there, that it's not over. And this is where it's important for U.S. companies to kind of step up and say, hey, wait a minute. We have deep relations, deep roots in parts of Latin America, of course, Denmark and Europe. So we got to kind of re-educate people on the benefits of globalization. I think we got to kind of get back to the what's good about globalization. We only read about what's bad, in terms of pandemics and supply chains and supply shortages. So we got to redirect the narrative, but we're not there yet. So I would say there's going to be an opportunity post-COVID-19 to reset, be heard, and I expect Denmark to be part of that conversation around ESG. Environment, social, and governance is huge, and I think there's a big role for Denmark to play.
Fantastic. Joe, thanks so much. We're out of time. I appreciate so much that you shared your thoughts with us today. Really insightful and on the transatlantic economy. And we certainly look forward to getting you to Denmark soon.
So I'm looking forward to getting there myself. So I never thought I'd want to get on a plane, but I'm dying to get on one. So thank you, Steve, and thanks for your leadership.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care of yourself, sir.